This is the Farm Voices podcast, sharing information about regenerative agriculture, climate resilience, and agricultural policy in the United States. I'm Kevin Castle. Today we are joined by Ryan Poe, farmer and founder of the Hungry Locavore in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Ryan, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. I'm looking forward to speaking about your collaborative work in farming and your innovative business model to get farm products into the community. You have a really interesting background leading to the Hungry Locavore, and working with the natural world is woven through your story. To give listeners an idea of the breadth of your experience, can you share a little bit about where you grew up, some of your work experiences, and how you came back to farming?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on the show. Really appreciate, the opportunity to share our open template and our open model. So yes, I grew up on a farm in Northern California, north and east of Sacramento at about 1,500 feet elevation. We were a homestead farm, so I did 4-H. We had livestock, rotational grazing, cover crops. We did a lot of row crops for pickling, canning, processing. We also had all kinds of different berries, fruit trees, nut trees, pretty much a polyculture system, low till, low impact on the soil. And one thing that I fondly remember the most about working with my dad, he would say it over and over every season about if you grow the soil, everything else will follow suit. It took a long time to wrap my head around what that meant, but through the processes and doing season after season with him, you could always see that the most important aspect was definitely to take care of the soil biome. As I got older, like any young man, I wanted to move off the farm, experience city life, do some different things. I went to San Diego State when I was 19. Down there, I kind of took a left turn instead of a right turn, and coincidentally got involved in saltwater fish and corals. I studied marine biology for about 15 years, and it's probably taken me to about 50 countries abroad. A lot of times with that work, I would visit farms and even fall into farming in certain circumstances. I did about a 1-year stint in Australia, farming in the outback, mostly grapes, some fruit trees and things like that. And then as the 08-09 meltdown kind of came into the peripheral for the economy here in America, the companies I worked for, we operated the biggest coral farms in North America, enclosed environments, very much like greenhouses or hoop houses. And we were doing it for the hobbyist trade as well as pharmaceutical companies. But as the economy started to collapse, we kind of spiraled out of control, and the company basically went out of business by 2012. And like everybody else, I went back to school. But I also started to see as I was getting older that I really had this desire to continue farming. And shortly thereafter, we moved from Newport Beach, California to Ann Arbor. In 2017, I joined the farming community here, and I've probably worked on about 10 different farms in the area, some as land contracts, operator owner type style, some as just paid labor. I'm currently one of the, percentage of people that don't own land that do a lot of farming. As you discussed earlier, there is a challenge to try to get on land at an affordable cost as well as turnover or profit. So we're kind of in the works this spring. There's been some interesting arrangements proposed to me where I can occupy land, and instead of a cash exchange or a contract or a wage for it, that we trade the goods to retail stores or the farmhand owners. And that way they get to sell it in the retail store, and then I add the food to my project, which is very fascinating. It's a very alternative agreement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks for mentioning that.
Yep.
And so geographically, could you explain where you're located and also where you farm?
Yep. So I'm in the southeast corner of Michigan, in Ann Arbor specifically. We usually rank in the top 10 as far as supporting local food systems or CSAs, community supported agriculture programs. We have a really strong, diversified portfolio of farmers markets in the area. We have some of the highest capacity for actually like licensed farms that are registered. I think we're at somewhere around like 70 or 80 small mom and pop farms and pretty much like a 30 or 40-mile radius, which is pretty high density. And it creates a diversified portfolio of goods being produced by these farms. I currently work at Sealy Farm. That's a young couple that own the farm. Their original vision was to do row crops, no-till, certified organic, no chemical inputs, cover crops, straw, very very minimal tilling. And if there's even tilling, usually it's just like dragging a tooth through one area just so you can plant the plants directly in that cavity per se.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very minimal soil disturbance. Sealy's kind of gone through multiple eras of farming. Like all farmers, it's a constant evolution. They started out as traditional row crops. About 7 years ago, they erected the flower co-op here. That is a band of other farmers that produce a master list of up to 100 or more different types of flowers, both perennials and annuals. And I chose to work at that farm just because it's a different look. When you do traditional row crops or orchards or fruit farms, sometimes you just get stuck in the monotony of it. And it was just very interesting to do a regenerative no-till farm with flowers as the primary focus. It's lightweight, it's upright. I'm 46, so as you get older, most farmers traditionally say you start to migrate away from the ground and you start to work upright.
Mm.
So this is kind of that beginning period of aging into a farming system. The ego of carrying watermelons and crates of potatoes out of the field are long gone. I mean, it's still fun, but physically, when you're doing some regenerative practices, the labor can be a lot more intense. So,
Mm-hmm.
plus, I also like the cohesiveness of the flowers. The flower beds, most of them are perennials on the farm. There is a fair amount of annuals too, but watching the ecosystem just coexist together, and you really are playing a very minimal part. You're just adding more biodiversity to it, basically. So a lot of the land is very well preserved. It's not being destroyed, and if anything, it's creating more waste stations for more biological impact. And then we can also play around with different cover crops and things that can coexist with these plants. And the real target is that we're growing the soil again. That really is kind of the bigger picture of it all.
Mm-hmm. So you've touched on this already, but would you like to talk more about the types of crops that you are growing and that you specialize in or that you're extremely passionate about?
Yeah. At Sealy, most of it is, like I said, a flower production. We do some storage crops like carrots, potatoes, beets, just for the simplicity of them, as well as the ability to hold them in storage. It's a long winter here in Michigan. Usually we go pretty close to 6 months of not growing outdoors. And some of the vital aspects to my project and running a weekly at-will CSA every week is that there does become a point in the season where it's a bear market. So we're trying to encourage more people like Sealy Farm and other farms just to maybe grow like 2 or 3 staple crops, but not the exact same ones. And then that way we still have a reservoir to draw from to produce interesting shares.
Mm-hmm.
Me personally, I've done some stuff with like keystone species with like monarchs. That is a very big passion of mine. Michigan is kind of like a main artery for that 3rd and 4th generation of monarchs. And right now the habitat is pretty depleted. There's actually some initiatives that look like they're going to get on the ballot here in the next year about creating way stations, stop mowing the highway center divides, and actually produce common milkweed seeds and spread them. I'm hugely into that process. Every year on farms and my personal yard and garden and stuff like that, for about the last 10 years, we've probably released over 250 monarchs. So I target capias for that, tithonias, zinnias, flowers that the monarchs are attracted to. And then the real thing that's kind of interesting is I spent a lot of time working in Mexico in the coral reefs, and there's a tropical milkweeds all over down there. They're not native up here; they're annuals. But when we put them into our gardens here, I mean, the monarchs just swarm them, hundreds of caterpillars. So it's it's pretty cool to integrate that into the school systems and kind of spread education and awareness about that. But that is probably one of my favorite things to kind of pursue is alternative growing methods like that.
Mm-hmm.
Things that are non-traditional, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's great. In simple terms, how do you define your farming practices, and what are the most important values or principles to your farming?
So the farming practices, again, going back to the soil, building that biome, constantly studying it, doing different inputs to it. And what I mean by that is like cover crops. A lot of the farms that I work with, we kind of profit share knowledge. Obviously, I work with a huge demographic of farmers. Today, probably over 100 in this area. But when you show up to farms, you get that firsthand experience like you're doing it yourself because you get to talk to these people. They have decades of experience. Some are super senior farmers and some are young. But we try to pluck a little bit of wool off each lamb's tail and then spread that knowledge back into the farming community. And then that way everybody just grows better, stronger, and it's a way to buffer mistakes. The most important thing to me though is definitely the soil biome. Um, Obviously feeding it, seeing the organisms, micro and macro, moving about through the soil. I do a lot of vermiculture, which is worms, and just doing like the deciduous tree leaves on a lot of the row crops is one, a way to protect the soil from the cold and the wind during the wintertime. And two, instead of using straw or introducing seeds, the leafy litter is pretty safe without encouraging more work in the growing season of weeding and spending time not growing and more labor, I guess. So with the vermiculture, that creates aeration in the soil. It rebalances the structure of the soil by moving through and allows fungal networks to kind of help digest the nutrients so the plants can uptake that. That's a huge part of my ongoing studies on my own personal level to farming. Cover crops too. There's heavy clay out here in Michigan. You either are in heavy sand or heavy clay, and most of the fields are heavy clay here. So trying to put cover crops is a huge deal. Most of the farms that I work with, they have a principle of no bare soil. Mm-hmm. So that could either be the leafy litter, that could be cover crop plants. Some of the cover crops that we do use, white Dutch clover. Very interesting, some case studies with some of the blueberry farmers I work with. You're sequestering carbon, you're cooling the temperature of the soil, and all roots that grow, in whether it's an annual or perennial, there's a constant temperature, like around 50 degrees, that a lot of that stuff likes, give or take. The clovers kind of give you a buffer there. They trap moisture there. They pollinate for the butterflies and the bees. Aesthetically, they're pretty, and they also obviously drop nitrogen into the soil through their tubers. We do vetch, we do rye, we do alfalfa, we do oats, we do peas, and then the last case scenario is some of the ground cover is just not enough. We'll implement straw. Mm-hmm. Straw is a very good weed barrier, puts iodine in there, traps moisture, creates more of that micro and macro life in the soil underneath it. So you can kind of use that instead of silage tarps and plastic materials that oxidize and biodegrade in the field. I am definitely more of a carbon input person than let's put more plastic in the system. I mean, plastic's everywhere. We have drip tapes and things like that. And the more we can reduce on that stuff, I think the better it is for the environment.
Well, the interesting thing too is that where you are, you have a lot of leaf material. Sort of the beauty of Michigan and all of the wonderful trees as well as the agricultural land. And so I love that you're using that as both a sort of mat to go over the soil and keep weeds down, but also to add nutrition back to it. Is that?
Yeah, and that is a really good thing to mention there. With having heavy clay in most of the growing mediums here, it can definitely be tricky to break that open. Some of the fields I've worked on out here, we've put alfalfa on the field and basically cut it 2 or 3 times a season. But the alfalfa root can grow up to 20 feet below the surface. So really just using that as a way to just open the soil up and then allow all that topsoil and all those organic nutrients to drop down into those crevices. It's just a faster way to rehabilitate a field. Sometimes, there is limits to how much carbon the soil can take, but I am constantly trying to push those barriers and just really trying to put that in there. I think if you have heavy, nutritious soil like that, the food that you produce on it, it's undoubtedly more nutritious. It's got more health benefits. I mean, it looks spectacular physically,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a real good symbiosis to get, the best production out of there. And I don't do a lot of large scale farming, even though I have done that. I've worked on properties that were like 400 acres, 50 to 60 different crops. As I get older, I find that the market style farm, that's generally referenced at a farm that's anywhere from like 2 to 5 acres. I think you can do a lot in that capacity. And especially if you focus on the soil and how much inputs you're putting on it like that, you can do more high density and kind of strategically succession plant. That's a big thing in this area is succession planting. A lot of farmers are scaling back, and instead of putting like 500 tomatoes out, they'll do like 20, and then 2 weeks later 20 more, and 2 weeks later 20 more, and 2 weeks later 20 more, and then that way you have successions of harvest, but also you don't get overrun by the work having all these plants mature at the exact same time. So it kind of helps you distribute your workload a little more evenly instead of just a huge abundance and then nothing. It takes away the feast or famine aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I know that working in cooperation with the ecology of the land is very important to you. Would you like to talk more about conservation agriculture or regenerative agriculture practices that are central to your work?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of covered a little bit about that in there. I think the biggest thing is that coexisting with the existing flora and fauna on property. One, you can learn a lot about what's happening on your property and where things need to be mended or things are kind of balanced. Um, the most important thing to me is like diversity. Diversity rules it all. So the more diversity you can add to it into any farming system, I think the better it is. Whether that's animals or rotational grazing, we talked about the dry leaves and things like that. Rotating your crops, obviously, so you don't deplete soils and specific elements. But I think one of my favorite things to do, and I learned this just maybe 10 years ago, is I like to do every fourth row in my fields with a flower, like a mixed flower bed. So it could have 50 different species of different pollinating flowers. I like to do that. And one thing that I really learned by doing that is I isolated about a quarter of an acre. I did every fourth row in flowers, and then I flanked the whole perimeter of the field in the square that it was in by flowers. And one thing I learned immediately is that the plants that coexisted in there, specifically brassicas, that was my test here, is to see if the cabbage white and the predators from other insects that like to eat those greens and those flowers and stuff. I noticed almost immediately like there was no impact from pests from doing that. And I'd sit out there at sunrise and sunset in the height of summer, and you could see it was just like a bug highway all the way around the flower beds. Everything's moving, consuming, pooping, peeing, flying. It's creating movement in the atmosphere. But I also think that the plants reacted very positively to it. You could tell they were being manicured and they were being looked after. But that was kind of a proof that the ecology will take care of itself if you kind of put the set and setting together. And for the patrons too, when they come out and they see stuff like that, it kind of re-fortifies our movement that we're not a sterile cornfield or a soybean field or a winter wheat field, which is very, very common in this area. Those fields are generally lifeless with one monocrop dominating the whole landscape. And the natural world is just not designed for that. The natural world should look like a packet of Skittles spilled across the canvas, and it should be cohesive with millions of organisms coexisting together.
And I love that you've brought up motion again, because you also mentioned legislation to possibly change the way that the landscaping is managed along the highway system. But you're again describing the movement of the insects and the natural members of our neighborhood that are part of our food system and that we need to be considering as we design these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty big part of it. I think that, you know, the human need to control the environment is something that came from Western Europe, and we brought grass lawns here, and we brought a lot of like monocropping and monoculturing here. It's very destructive to the land, the earth, the water systems. I mean, even the inputs that they put into it with the fossil fuel fertilizer, factory farm chicken manures. You know, a lot of that stuff's just bad news. And in reality, we are feeding sick food to sick people. That's becoming very prevalent in the local tone of the country. But the problem is there really is no gateway to any of that access. If you have to look for that stuff at this current time, it requires work. People have to like move to an area, figure out where all the farms are, when they're open, how do you get their goods. If the farmers market isn't really that productive because it's a cold time of year, people can get very deterred and kind of just drift back to big box store buying. That's what kind of where the Hungry Locavore and just the idea of like creating a circular economy based off seasonality of food that is available in our biome or region, which is what a locavore is by definition. So bringing that project into the public eye has created really interesting interest because agritourism is extremely popular. There's a lot of people that want to have connection to the land. You know, they show up for like, hey, help pick the seconds and we'll donate it to a food bank, or come out to a lavender field and take pictures, or the sunflower fields. People want an affinity and a contact with that land because our world is so digitized and so instant gratification. I find a lot of solstice and peace, you know, when I go onto these properties and you see these aesthetics and these beautiful things happening on these farmlands. That is just not one dominant plant strain. And, you know, the diversity that it offers, not only to the natural world, but also to the human population. The project is designed as a form of healthcare. Eating clean, healthy food, it's higher nutrition, it's better for you, it's better for the planet, it has less fossil fuels. We've reduced almost all the plastic out of our boxes. So we're really trying to achieve like a carbon neutral local food system. And the real beauty about it is in about a 4 week span, I usually feature anywhere from 60 to 75 local businesses. All that money is just circulating in our economy. It's not circulating out of our economy and going down to Mexico for avocados or anything like that. We're trading hands within our community. I also try to target a lot of younger farmers and younger chefs. The demographic, most of the farmers in this country are in their mid 60s or older. There really isn't a generation behind it coming up at scale. And the ones that are coming up are just gigantic factory farms. You know, and they're big polluters. They do a lot of damage to the ecosystem. And a lot of it's really unnecessary. I mean, I just had a conversation with a farmer that's selling 7,000 conventional acres because he's basically saying he's not making any money and it's a heavily subsidized industry, and he's just had enough of it. I tried to convince him. I was like, you know, if you just grow 2 or 3 crops, you could integrate into the school system and sell all these future kids of America like real carrots and potatoes and beef, you know? And we are working on that too. Outside of being a farmer and running the Hungry Locavore, I am part of the local government here. There's a project called the A20, which is a 2030 Paris Accord climate agreement on reduction through our municipalities, water, sewer, trash, the local food systems, getting rid of one-time use plastic waste, and the restaurant industry. And I'm part of the Sustainable Food Business Coalition. And what that is basically farmers and chefs working together to provide the food for tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And that means like we're a big think tank that shares resources and education, but we're also creating bridges where people can participate in this bigger, larger movement of local food systems. And it's a way to be off grid, resilient, diversified. Um, Ann Arbor is very multicultural. We have University of Michigan here, and we also have automotive here. So there's a lot of transients like myself that have moved here, and they want to support these local systems. So it's kind of a sweet science that we've like landed here and have integrated and put some pretty deep roots into the community.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Thank you for mentioning those other organizations and projects. Could I back up for just a moment and ask you to explain more about Ann Arbor's participation in Paris climate?
Yep. So this past week, I just participated in a meeting. We went to the campus. It's called University of Michigan Dining. I believe they have roughly 30 cafeterias on campus, and their goal was to reduce food waste by 40%. They've already achieved that goal and by 2030 now they've upped it to 60%. And some really interesting key notes that I took away from that is instead of having a 10-inch plate, they offer like 8-inch plates. And instead of giving a tray, you can only take a plate now. They also had a system where you can only have 2 meals a day through the university. Now it's wide open. You can come as many times as you want. And it's really fascinating to see behind the scenes and look at all their mathematical numbers and the way they're just reducing the food waste. They've also got a campus farm, which is diverting some of that waste back into organic material to grow more food, which I think is really, really exciting. With the A20, with my role in that, that's just about raising more awareness about regenerative farming practices, how people can get into a gateway system and learn about the farms that are in the area, specifically through the Hungry Locavore. We generally try to target different farms and different chefs every week. And by doing that, we tell their stories in a really informative, very transparent, and very accountable way of the local food systems. And we get basically a passenger eye view of how the boxes come together each week. And the A20 panel is grabbing onto that because that traction generates income and finances and taxes and things that are basically staying interlocked into the community. So it's a fascinating think tank to kind of cross over from the private sector to the public sector, which generally you don't see a lot of that happening. But it's trickling down even into like you can designate your yard now here in the city to a pollinator waste station garden. So if you have a neighbor that says, "Hey, we want pretty manicured grass mowed every week," and then you start to grow gigantic flowers in your yard, by registering your yard, there's no pushback from the city to give you a citation for not having a clean, tidy yard. But again, like more and more that I see, especially when I'm farther away from the city, I see the things that drive me crazy is like you see a monocrop field and then you see a 5-acre parcel of all mowed grass. And it's like 50 years ago, the yard would have been full of berries and row crops that you didn't grow as a conventional crop. But you'd have fruit trees, berries, row crops, chickens, animals moving about. That would be the primo way station for all the wildlife. But now we're monocropping the grass that the farmer lives on, and then we're monocropping the grass corn in the field. And so I think cities are going to eventually become the hub for the natural world to coexist if we continue the pace that we're currently at. So I do a lot of advocacy for that as well, setting up rain gardens. A lot of people here like to rake their leaves, put them in a brown bag, and then have the composting truck pick it up.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just thousands of miles of fuel for nothing, and bags that got shipped from Mexico or China just to be put leafy litter in and sent back to the landfill. And I get that they're making compost out of that, but if a lot of people kept those inputs on site, that would dictate more moss, more butterflies, more flying insects, specifically fireflies. A lot of our ecosystems, as we work as farmers, last year was really, really alarming. we had basically zero insect pressure until like almost August, like absolutely nothing. No potato beetles, cucumber beetles, cabbage white butterflies, aphids. I mean, it was basically devoid. And even seeing like the species of moth at night on the flowers versus the butterflies during the day, the population counts were really, really low. And talking with etymologists and things like that, a lot of the concern, even at university level, the people that do this professionally, as well as just the farming level, a lot of the signs were basically very alarming that we're losing those species. And then there was a bird study through the Audubon Society saying that a lot of the bird species are in decline and the migration numbers are lower. And that stuff will have impacts on our food system. As we create more deserts and less diversity, that's definitely gonna have negative impacts on our lifestyle as well as our food systems. And if we lose those links in the chain, then that's when the system really starts to spiral out of control, which is very fascinating. And part of the AT0 panel is gearing funding, grant writing, and more public awareness through community engagements. And since we're not in season right now farming actively, it's kind of the calm before the storm. Pretty much for the next 3 months, my whole target is to basically public engage. So I did 2 speaks at University of Michigan this week about the need for young call to arms for young farmers, but also through grants and education and internships, and just try to get people back onto the land.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because people in this country generally don't respect food. And I hate to say that, but I mean, we throw millions of pounds. I mean, I think it's like 35 billion or 35 million pounds of food every year as a society. And that's huge greenhouse gas waste is going into the atmosphere via the landfill. Whereas if we could just do these local food systems like the Hungry Locavore, non-subscription based, every box is at will, everything is very transparent and clear on the menus. It gives people an opportunity to opt in and out and have control over the food that they get. And by having control, that means the traditional CSA could be 16 to 18 weeks or longer, give or take. People get inundated with that food. And when I grew up doing that kind of model, we'd have customers that would stay with us for 1 or 2 years, but the association with throwing the food away, giving the food away, became a big problem. And people would step out of the program. And it was always like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, you know, and we were slowly growing our crowd. But this model is designed to basically allow people to have a life. You know, sometimes it's just not going to work. Sometimes they don't like the menu. Sometimes they want to travel to the south to get away from the cold. So we try to meet everybody at their level and where they're at. And this is a great gateway for that.
I have so many questions for you about your farming practices. Is there anything else you would like to say about those questions? I feel like we should explain more about your project and maybe jump into those questions now, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yep. Maybe we can come back to the other things.
Yeah.
So in addition to your brilliant work in farming, which is nothing less than brilliant, you have an innovative business that focuses on methods to connect the food with the community. Could you explain more about the Hungry Locavore and this unique product?
Yeah, so the Hungry Locavore is an aggregated CSA. So aggregated means you're bringing stuff from off, not just your own farm, but off farm goods. Again, I keep using the word diversity. Diversity really is the spice of life. The project is designed to basically showcase as many local businesses as possible that support Michigan-made goods. So in some facet or form, if you're the baker and you're buying local butter or milk or cheese, that still would fit under the criteria of like locally sourced goods. And our real big outlook is we want all the money that we spend to stay within the borders of Michigan for multiple reasons. Less fossil fuels, less packaging materials, getting food from the ground to the plate as fast as we can. Most of the food that I source comes from about a 40-mile radius of where we live. So If we're spending the money into the economy like that, we're also in the radius of where people have reach to and access points to those farms and those restaurants. So we kind of are like the gateway to the local food system. Most of the new people that buy the boxes or get involved in the project, they'll sign up and they'll be like, I had no idea these 2 or 3 farms are like a mile from my house. I had no idea they have an honor stand. I have no idea that they had an on-site farmers market every day of the week that I can just go in there and buy whatever I want. And that's kind of like the feel-good narrative that we're trying to offer, is that, one, we're exposing people to local food. Local food in general is, like I said earlier, is a form of healthcare. Healthcare is expensive. Eating clean food, it has a very big stigma about, well, it's organic, it's going to be expensive. But that's not necessarily the case now. The inflation in the big box stores, I walk through 5 or 6 grocery stores every week just to keep my finger on the pulse, where we're pricing this stuff, where it's coming from, based off what we offer and what the big box store offers. And in general, we offer 20% more for 20% less. And what I mean by that is, like, if you go into the store and you buy an onion for $2 right now, we're giving like 3 or 4 onions as, a bulk price, because we're getting it for a fair trade price from the farmers. We pass that on to the consumer, and the margins on the project are very small, but it's done with intentionality. People have to get their feet wet before they jump into the pool. And if we can get their feet wet with a safe, easy, cost-effective margin, the bigger vision is that this is a marathon. This project was designed to take more than 5 years to really mature. I'm already at year 8 with this project in 3 different lives. And it's pretty advanced, especially to get the ball rolling. I mean, it is a mad box of frogs. There's so many variables and human elements and things that could go sideways. It takes a real good communicator, somebody that's consistent, and you just follow through with the time schedule. But there were some very influential documentaries. One was called Sustainable. It came out maybe 10 years ago, based around Illinois, and a farmer with kind of the same visionary concepts that I have. He came back to the family farm. It was completely dilapidated and ruined by conventional farming. He resurrected the farm, diversified the farm's portfolio of crops, and then he also brought in the community around him. It was also sharing the blight and the rundown of conventional farming. Mm-hmm. And they basically created a coalition of growers that specifically grew just for chefs. And the chefs would ask for different produce items, so the group would unanimously vote, like, hey, do you want to grow beets, or do you want to grow carrots? They would pool their resources together, but by creating a master list of a whole bunch of produce and then sending it all down into the big city, now their list became much more desirable as a one-stop shop. And it really resurrected the whole community based off of diversifying their portfolio and working together. Mm-hmm. So this country right now is pretty divisive. And the Hungry Locavore is kind of one of these anchors where it's like, we're inclusive, we're diversified, and we welcome as much diversity as possible that we can offer in these boxes. So it's hard to explain it in a nutshell very concisely, just because there is so many moving parts. Mm-hmm. But the real vision is to the food systems are unsustainable across the whole globe. And young people need to jump into this line of work. I think there's a ton of longitude and latitude in this space. And the other thing is, we all eat 3 meals a day. If every community, even if we were 40 miles apart and every state erected a project like this, we could draw down an immense amount of greenhouse gases. I mean, we would take hundreds of thousands of vehicles off the road, flights transporting food, trains transporting food. And we could just create local food hubs and units where the education falls with the in-season narrative of the food. And I think that is the bigger vision of the food systems and where it's going.
Mm-hmm. I have more questions for you about the specific details of the business, but I want to quickly underscore something that you said, which I think was really important. And I think I mentioned that I'm originally from Michigan, and especially in southeastern Michigan, we often talk about blight in terms of communities that are urban in nature, but you just used the word blight to refer to rural areas. And I think that's so important because it is true that the damage from conventional agricultural practices runs down the environment. It runs down the productivity of that land and takes away so much of the diversity of the economy. And I think that's really important to recognize.
Yeah. It's heartbreaking to see it, to be honest with you. You go out there and a lot of people think because it's organized and the rows are uniform that it's aesthetically pretty. But really, what it really comes down to is a lot of these farms are just doing what their dad did. There's no second questioning it. Even though science is starting to question that, a lot of these people are just comfortable with the government subsidies. They know that they can ride the tractor out, bolt the crops into the ground, come back, fossil fuel fertilize it, and then obviously put some kind of input on herbicide, fungicide, or pesticide. And then they really just come back and they harvest the fruit. So when you look at it like that, it's like, what kind of farming is that? You're not even participating in the ecosystem. You're just sitting back, letting these big machines that compact soil do a lot of the work. And then second, that food that's being grown on those crops like that winter wheat, that soy, and that corn, which is predominant for the Midwest, if you look at where that food chain is going, that is going into the frozen food aisle as fillers, fake sugars, the breadcrumbs on chicken nuggets. But like a lot of saturated fats and oils and things like that are being processed by that food, soft drinks. And that is something that's definitely degrading our society as well. And, there should be some limits to that. With the new administration, the RFK Jr., that's very fascinating to me. He's one of the only politicians that's really speaking up against it. And the challenge is enormous. I mean, you've got like Monsanto, and then you've got Roundup under multiple names. And then you've got the fossil fuel industry, which is an enormous gorilla. When we came out of World War II, we didn't have an enemy to fight, so we started to fight the natural world with all of our pesticides, herbicides, and heavy machinery. But what we also did discover is that you can take fossil fuels and you can drive them into pelletized fertilizer, which basically doubled farmers' crops overnight. And this is how we got into where we're currently at right now. That's why corn is only grown like 3 to 6 inches apart per plant. I mean, they're literally counting how many stalks they can fit onto the land. And it's really a system of, can you squeeze blood out of a rock? And eventually those systems are definitely going to fail. We're already well on our way. There's some farms, where we've stepped in. I did a project back during the pandemic. We took over 187 acres with a triangle partnership that I had. The farm had been conventionally farmed since 1960s. I mean, we tried to plant asparagus in the ground, and it was literally like concrete. It was crazy how rough and lifeless the soil was. So we did hugel mounds on there where we dumped tons of carbon and wood chips. Tons of inputs in there. We erected basically a U-pick strawberry patch, 800-foot rows, 50 beds. We did about 15 rows of mixed berries at 800 rows, and about 15 rows of blueberries at 800 feet, 15 rows. 5 acres of asparagus, 400 chestnut trees. And we basically tried to give the land like an overhaul where, one, those crops are all perennial crops. So we're not going to go back in and open the soil back up. We were just basically bioloading the soil with as much carbon as we could to try to get some anatomy and autonomy back into that soil to like revitalize it. This is about 5 years into it now. And I mean, still the soil just needs so much work. It's like, it's unbelievable like how long it could take. And for like, say that was my own property, I mean, I could spend my whole life trying to remend that soil. It is a very long-term project to try to rehab that stuff. So I guess where I'm going with that is the longer we continue the conventional crops and monocrops like that, that means that somebody in the next generation is going to inherit that disaster, which is going to be extremely tumultuous and very challenging to try to tackle. And And you're going to need that land. I mean, the population is only going to swell, and as education gets better and people adopt to local food systems, they're probably going to live longer just because they'll be eating a healthier diet and a more diversified diet. But that also means it's going to put more pressure on the system, because there's only so many calories. And once they're consumed, you have to re-strategize and organize to be able to get back into that space and be productive with it.
Mm-hmm. Let's return to the community-supported agriculture, the idea of community-supported agriculture, and the innovation that is slightly different than that you're using. Could you explain what your model is?
Yeah. So community-supported agriculture, CSA, that is a coin frame to basically get citizens to sign up to a farm for X amount of weeks, and then they pay up front and they're guaranteed X amount of crops from that farm. An allotment each week of whatever the farm has in season. So there's kind of a little bit of smoke and mirrors there. One, the farmer just gives an itinerary roughly of what will be available and when. But as you know, in farming, things can collapse. Bad weather, frost, storms, washouts, floods. I mean, all the above can happen. So the inconsistency of that model is definitely something that can create irritation unknowingly, where you don't supply what you thought you could due to the demand of that. So with the Hungry Locavore, we call it a CSAA, so Community Supported Agriculture and Artisan Goods. The artisan goods is kind of a twist because life is busy, and it only seems to get busier and busier for everybody in every walk, whether they're too engaged in social media or the pressure of working the 9 to 5. A lot of people feel like they need a feel-good narrative and a break. So we offer 6 to 8 produce items with 3 or 4 prepared foods. On the prepared foods, we ask that the chefs integrate local food into the prepared foods. So, hey, we have a bunch of kale right now. It looks beautiful. Let's make a kale salad. Okay, send me, 20 bunches of kale. We'll get some tomatoes and some cucumbers and some onions. We'll mix it all together. And then when you advertise it in the menu, you name drop all those farms as produce contributors to that dish. So we're layering up the process of yes, you're getting celery from Cell Farms, but you're also getting a salad made from Cell Farms kale. And then we mix that in there. It's done with intentionality. The farmers need more sales. And so if we can get the chefs to buy from them and then we buy from them, now they've gotten 2 sales in 1 week. And that's basically just shifting the marketplace away from, like Cisco Foods or like Costco delivery. Mm-hmm. And you get these chefs to work one-on-one with the farmers directly. And that is also an enormous part of the project behind the scenes. It's not in the public eye. So I'll work with chefs, I'll look at their menu, I'll be like, hey, you guys have mushrooms in every single dish. Who's the mushroom farmers you work with? Oh, we don't do anything local. Well, here's 3 or 4 right here that do mushrooms year-round. Combined, they do like 15 different species. Here's their cell phone. They can deliver to you. What I would suggest is call Johnny, tell him you want some samples, bring him up here, give him a dish with your mushrooms in it. That way you guys will get some camaraderie going, and you can build your own relationship outside of my project. Mm-hmm. And behind the scenes, that is the most gratifying part. We've connected hundreds of farmers to markets they never knew existed. And yes, I don't get any royalties or any money or anything. I'm not being paid to do that. The process is just about doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. And if we can bring these people together and get them to work cohesively, again, it's just doubling down on keeping the finances stuck in a circular economy, which is very fascinating. With the artisanal goods, too, to answer that a little clearer, that could go under prepared foods, bread. We've offered like tithonia and milkweed as like live plants in the box, just to encourage people to put those flowers in their garden. Again, that's looking out for our pollinators and our waste station insects. And inadvertently, people get pleasure out of it. Bright red flower, who's going to be sad about that? And then all of a sudden, they have monarchs and butterflies in their yard. Whereas they could be the conventional people that are mowing their grass every week. Now that I designate a little spot, that spot gets a little bigger. The area, the suburb gets a little more diversified.
Mm-hmm.
Neighbors catch on, so we're kind of like, we constantly are seeding. That's the
Mm-hmm.
best way to put analogies here. Since I'm a succession crop farmer, I never put all my eggs in one basket. I just do lots of successions of lots of diversity. That way, if anything fails, then I'm just not out in the cold. And it kind of does the same thing with the project, offering that diversity. For Earth Day, we've done seed packets, we've done glass straws, we've done potted basil plants. Yeah, and then to artisanal goods, I mean, we've had some people do like vegetable bags that they made out of old hemp sacks. And they were like, hey, we want to sell these to you. And I'm like, genius idea. You just get rid of their plastic, and then when they come pick up their box, they can just load all their roots into that bag and just bring it back to me over and over and over.
Mm-hmm.
That way I'm not giving them more plastic they don't want. And that way the landfill's not getting more plastic than it wants. So we're constantly just trying to recalibrate. That's a real clutch word with this program. It is always in an evolution. And I think that is in parallel with the natural world.
Mm-hmm.
The natural world is constantly evolving and things are changing and adapting. And we want to kind of portray that image through this project.
Mm-hmm. And I think you've answered this question, but would you like to say anything more about the importance of aggregation as a from a farm business standpoint?
Definitely, and that is a good question there, and I didn't hit that very hard. So aggregating shares, a lot of people get confused by that. They're like, okay, so are you just making money like buying other people's stuff and then marking it up and reselling it? There is a little bit of that to that, but also aggregating is you can tell people stories through the informative newsletter that accompanies every box specific contents. But by telling those stories and aggregating those boxes, one, as a farmer, I can learn a lot about growing better practices in my own business, but it also diversifies our portfolio as far as who we feature. And everybody has different trigger points. Like I was saying before, like a lot of people, they don't know that farms exist in their neighborhood. It's a path of discovery for a lot of people. And doing the aggregated model is, yes, I could traditionally grow all the crops myself and just call it, the Hungry Locavore's farm or whatever, and we could dominate our market with our produce and then their prepared foods. But really, that's going back to almost a traditional CSA model. And the real narrative here is like, if we can all grow together, both grow the food together, but also grow financially together, that support system and that diversified portfolio of all those people working together cohesively, it's a huge think tank and exchange of ideas. And part of that aggregating note there is that that's a pretty powerful tool, because at the government level, they're not looking out for the local level. And this is a way to implement the local level that has a say and diverts that money from that big monocrop system. And that's how we basically change the food system. We are diverting money away from the big box store. And then eventually, if this model catches on, which it is, I've talked to probably about 20 different people across the country about how we got here, how did we start this, how do you break away from that traditional CSA and that food waste and that idea. And the other thing is, when we aggregate, we're not in competition with each other either. Like when I grew up in farmers markets, it was like, hey, don't put your slice of tomatoes next to mine. We're in competition here. You know, and I would always just say, well, just grow something else or diversify your crop rotation. But now we're kind of breaking down those barriers, and the farmers are more than happy to work side by side with farms that they might have thought they had some tension with or that there's competition there. And instead, it kind of gets people to drop their guard and try to have the conversation, like, how do we get better? And like, how do we grow more crops and do more interesting models? And when we share the newsletters with all the vendors and the patrons, everybody's learning together and we're all thinking together and working together and profit sharing ideas as well as the revenue from selling the boxes. It's pretty fascinating. And the aggregation, I think, is a very positive thing. And some of the years in the second life of the project, I worked for a farm out here, and that farm dominated the produce lineup. And the patrons definitely gave us feedback that they were tired of that. They were like, we want that diversified portfolio again. It's just not as interesting as it was when there was a whole bunch of farms and a whole bunch of looks and a whole bunch of people. When you start to just produce stuff off of the same farm, sometimes you almost get to a point where it's like you hit the ceiling, and it's like, how do you evolve out of that? It's like, how do you continue to grow? And doing aggregation, I think, is definitely it's a new form of farming. Some people are not immediately well into it, and then some people, they love the thought of it, because if you're small and you only have an acre or two and you can divert your food to a chef in one of our shares, that could skip you out of the farmer's market to grow more food. So it also creates other opportunities for the farmers to diversify their own portfolio by having that avenue revenue stream coming in.
There's two really interesting things that come to mind that you're doing here as well. One is to train people to accept that food tastes different from different farms and at different points in the season. If I got honey in the spring versus the fall, or from this farm or versus that farm over there, I will have a different product. And you're kind of educating people that this is good, normal, yep, and we should be able to take that on board rather than expect to grab the same bag of lettuce every week and it looks exactly the same. And the other thing I love is that you're creating a market for value-added products, which is one really hard thing to move into sometimes for a farm. But you're creating the market and kind of the landing spot, which encourages that diversity again of the products and the experimentation, and that's amazing.
Yeah, and it is tricky, It's taken a long time to get here. And I'm not heavily on social media. And some people say that's a downfall, that we're not like bomb blasting it to try to get more people to come onto the project. But as we grow organically in the fields, we also grow the project organically by word of mouth. And the word of mouth does trickle down, going back to the aggregate. A lot of people will tell other people about it. Like, hey, I'm working with this guy. And like, that sends me new farms to work with me. It also sends me new chefs to work with me, but it also sends more ideas to add to the project. So we're kind of on the cusp of like that snowball going down the hill, and it's getting steadily larger and larger and larger. Eventually there will be a ceiling to it based off of our capacity of the chefs. The project isn't really designed to sell more than 200 boxes. And at this point, we're only selling about 50 to 70 per week. I think 100 is the sweet spot. So if other people are looking at this model across the nation, you have to really look at your demographic and like how much people can handle. Because say if we drop a 200 unit order on a mom and pop restaurant, that could restructure their whole shift management, how much storage space they got. So you have to kind of look at those variables and like find that sweet science. And it is tricky, but I think every day I wake up and I kind of think, like, what can I do that is a little bit different than I did today, both in the field and within the business? And just try to put myself under the microscope. It's like, how can we get out there and find this organically, meaning like word of mouth transfer for both new vendors and new patrons? Mm-hmm. And we're steadily trying to figure out that sweet science, but it's all a work in progress, and that's the thing that motivates me. Working with coral reefs for 15 years is extremely advanced, much more so than working on farm properties, even though that is actually pretty advanced as well. But trying to work in that capacity, that is definitely in my wheelhouse. Every day I go out there as a constant student, it's like, well, what can I learn and what am I missing here? And like, how can I see this landscape differently and like contribute to it, not just take, and ways that you harvest and ways that you cultivate and ways that you engage the plants. I did some really interesting things about 7 or 8 years ago when I worked in a heated hoop house and greenhouse out here in the winter. I went into a lot of like sound therapy with the plants and played like music in the hoop houses to see how they would react, and it was interesting. There was some science there, and the plants are definitely a lot more sensitive. And I've read a lot of books about like, what do plants think and how do plants react to environments? And, if you pay attention to nature, nature will unlock the correlations. And that is my biggest thing is like, how can I unlock the correlations to make this better?
Mm-hmm.
More sufficient, more nutrient density, and try to be easy. I did a podcast with Jim Cohn last winter. We took about 80 hours of audio on that. And one thing that I really walked away with, he said, if you don't know what you're doing, the best thing to do is do nothing at all.
Mm-hmm.
And just wait and like watch and observe. In our current world, we are like so hyperactive to just have instant gratification.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas these models of the Hungry Locavore as well as the farming, let's take a lot of like think tank hours and not impulsive decisions to just build Rome in a day. It's you want to be steady and mindful
Mm-hmm. And physically present.
and physically present.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ryan Poe and the Hungry Locavore will be back in the next episode. We hope you'll join us again to learn more about his business model and the how and why of building hyperlocal food systems using regenerative and conservation agriculture methods. The Farm Voices podcast is produced by the Regenerative Agriculture Coalition, a working group of climate reality project leaders and chapter members. Please subscribe to this podcast, leave a review, and share the episode with others. It helps us raise the visibility of this important information, and we really appreciate your support. Have a great week.